Yeah, so I guess as a little preamble, we can begin, but a little preamble, I wanted to say to Javier Díaz de León that we're so excited that you're here. For everyone, if you're joining and you're not sure who he is, he's the Consul General of Mexico in Atlanta. And we spent some time earlier this week. I was speaking with President Ladani, who sends his regrets. He wanted very much to be here, and something came up, and he had to cancel many things. But he recently sent a letter, and I will just underscore how grateful OU is for the continued support from the Mexican consulate that is helping to fund scholarships for several of our students.
No, it's we couldn't be more thrilled. To be fair, I mean, of course, what we do is, of course, we have a small scholarship fund that we receive from Mexico City, and we convene a local group of education experts. So they receive the bids for scholarships that we receive from other colleges or schools around the region, and they choose, which are the best options. And of course, Oglethorpe has been one of those options for at least a couple of years, I think 2 or 3 years in a row. And it's because, of course, of the job that you do, not only in terms of giving access and opportunities to Latino students, but also the follow-up that you do on their academic, path. And of course, in this case, I mean, the reports that we get back from you on how this is impacting students from our community. So we couldn't be more happy and grateful for how this relationship has been developing.
Well, likewise, and I will say too, there are three students who I know recently in the last couple of years were, Oglethorpe, everybody, it's small. So I realized they were recipients, and I'm just going to mention them. Iris Pons, fantastic student who's now an alum. Also Katia Quintero, I'm going to mispronounce her last name. Fernanda, help me. Katia, yeah, you're at a loss as well. So Katia, now that I've called her out but mispronounced her last name, she'll give me hell for that. And also Manny Jose Portillo, who's was an intern for John Lewis. So students who are doing a lot, including, Katia and 2 other students. I'll tell you a little preamble here. She came to my office 4 years ago, around election time, and we were all kind of, to be blunt, commiserating. And I remember at that time thinking, I've got to do a show 4 years from now that focuses on Mexico. Oh. And it was then that the seed was planted, and it was because of a student, and it was because of election season, and here we are again. So
and I think, of course, I mean, all of not only the Mexican, but all the Latino students in Oglethorpe, sure, I think will be thrilled to find an exhibition there that in some way reflects, their life. Of course, everybody's different. Every case has very special circumstances, but see yourself in some way portrayed through artistic expression. I think it gives you a sense of belonging, that you are part of this community, you're part of this society, and of course they're part of this university.
Absolutely, I fully agree. So students and artists, are you ready to begin? Shall we move into our next phase? I'm not an old hat at webinar, but and Javier, if you'd like to stay on as a panelist, you can, or if you, I won't be able to minimize to change your status here, but you're welcome to do that as well, to weigh in. Okay. And I see, oh, there's Michelle saving me. Katia Gordillo Quintero. Thank you. There,
Gordillo Quintero.
Gordillo Quintero. There she is in the chat. Yeah. So, all right. Shall I start the screen share? I'm going to do that so that everybody can see the images of this artist's work. Maria Cristina Tavera, Tina Tavera, and I probably started talking a year ago, I want to say. Does that sound right? And we had no idea, no one did, what would happen this year, but I thank you from the bottom of my heart for persevering through very strange odds. You don't need art in the midst of an emergency, but you really need it immediately afterward. And you really need it to express yourself, and you really need it to to lift people up and carry them through. And your art in particular, which is so socially conscious and sometimes political, very personal, dealing with issues of identity, but with humor and compassion, is precisely what we need right now. So I thank you for not giving up through this year. and you know, and getting to know each other has been fantastic. And I will mention too, for those of you who are listening, that Tina lives in Minneapolis. So her response to the events of the past year is very interesting as well in that regard. And then the students who are they're going to introduce themselves, but we were lucky enough to connect with Fernanda and Rebecca through Rene Alvarez. And if he's here, thank you, Rene, who's the king of advising here at Oglethorpe, and not his official title, but that's how I think of him. And he said that the last few weeks, do you have something we could put together for the last few days of Hispanic Heritage Month? And after a year of planning, it came together in 2 weeks. So thanks to both of you for doing that. All right, I'm going to turn it over to you and share screen.
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth. And while you do that, I think I'll get started and introduce myself. My name is Rebecca Castro. I am class of 22, biopsychology major. I am Brazilian, and I am in the DEI, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Task Force. And I'm also Vice President of Programming for Phi Delta Epsilon.
Hi everyone, I'm Fernanda Martinez. I am also class of 22 here at Oglethorpe University. I'm a biology major with a minor in environmental studies, and that's about it.
Yeah, and we really do want to thank you guys for this opportunity. It was almost kind of like a strike of fate that we had this going on. 2 weeks before this event, we were meeting for the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Task Force, and we were saying, you know, we need to do something for Hispanic Heritage Month, but we want to do something that will honor it, and what do we do? And Rene Alvarez said, you know, just give me a minute. Steps out of the meeting, comes back 20 minutes later, all right, I have an idea. And then this beautiful event was born from that. So the name of this exhibition is called Promesas de Papel, or Paper Promises in English. And it is, we got a sneak peek of it today. It is a beautiful exhibition. Maria Cristina is incredibly talented, and I urge everyone on October 30th, when the exhibition goes live, to go and to see. It is incredibly deep, beautiful, and talented, is the least I could say. Okay, so the first thing that we want to talk about is identity and what it sort of means to be American, what it means to be Mexican. And Maria Cristina, how do you balance being American and Mexican? And I think this artwork of yours, you know, demonstrates it really well. It's Minnesota, but also Mexico. So we could dive into that.
First, I just want to say thank you to everyone involved. As Elizabeth said, this took a lot of stamina, and I really appreciated that she was still willing to install the exhibition and make sure that it still happened. And I also wanted to say thank you to the Consul Javier Díaz de León for making time to come today to celebrate with us. And the opening of the exhibition will actually be at the end of the month. But today I wanted to just share a little bit about some of the pieces that are in the work, and Fernanda and Rebecca and I will have a conversation. You can call me Tina if you want. Everyone calls me Tina for short as a nickname. This piece, it says Minnesota, Mexico, so it's very reflective of who I am. when I hear what does it mean to be an American, I think of the concept that it's a little nationalistic, I think, to say American. I think that America is part of North America, and I find it interesting how many times in the United States people refer to being Americans without consideration that Canada and Mexico are part of North America, and then there's Central and South America as well. But it is really important to me, I think, because I am the duality of the two countries. I have dual citizenship between Mexico and the United States, and living in the US, and I reside in Minnesota, which is in the middle of the United States, as far north as you can travel. And so this is a big part of who I am, I think. It's a big part of my identity as an artist, an independent curator, and a cultural organizer. Should we keep going?
Well, continuing this talk about identity, we'd like to talk about La Malinche Conquistada. Where did the inspiration for this come from? And where did this, since it's part of the Castro series, where did that get inspired from?
So so part of being bilingual, bicultural, my identity, I think, is that I think of myself as being an intersection of different mixture of politics and the arts and such. And so the thematic grounds of my art are pretty interdisciplinary. They're a combination of social sciences, history, politics, current events. And so I started thinking about what does it mean to be bicultural and to be mixed race. My father is Irish and is from St. Paul, and my mother is from Michoacan, Mexico, and most of the family is in Mexico City. So I have great nostalgia for the time that I've spent growing up in Mexico, even though most of the time I grew up residing in Minnesota. We went back and forth since my relatives are all there and I'm really close to them. And then I began to create compositions that have cultural signifiers that examine the constructions of race and ethnicity, gender, national and cultural identities. So this particular piece here is part of my fascination with being bicultural. I did a whole series of prints and prints and drawings that were based on casta. And casta was during the colonial period of Spain, when paintings were created to track the ranking of racial mixing and to discourage actually the people of European descent to commingle with people that were of a different ethnicity, such as indigenous or of African descent. And so the paintings, these prints, are the paintings themselves historically were of the 17th century. And so they actually used those paintings to determine grouping people based on race, to determine privileges and whether or not they were legal or customary, but they had access to certain things dependent on where they fell in that chart. So my interpretation for the Casta series isn't reiterating the same thing. I'm not looking at the family breakdowns of mixed race families, but instead, like, what does it mean to be categorizing mixed race throughout history and now in contemporary sort of societal constructs of racial categorization, such as Latinos in the United States. So this is one of the first prints that I made, and this is based on La Malinche. It's called La Malinche Conquistada because it is about La Malinche. La Malinche is here with Hernán Cortés, and he was a Spanish conquistador. He was credited for overtaking the Aztecs, and she was a victim of exploitation, so a slave, and became his translator and his mistress. Now, she birthed the first mixed race child in Mexico, according to this story. And so in Mexico, I find it interesting that she is often considered a traitor because he conquered Mexico. And yet at the same time, you know, now most Mexicans are of mixed race. There are mestizajes of Spanish and indigenous descent. I titled the piece La Malinche Conquistada because I felt that in a way she was conquered by him. Maybe, you know, she fell in love with him, we don't know, and maybe she just was overcome and taken control forcefully. And so I find it interesting now, like how mestizo people are viewed as being mixed, indigenous, and of Spanish descent. And so this is a screen print, and then there's some comics that are included that are referencing some domestic aggressions and violence.
I want to just interject that we will do the questions at the end because I realize I can't be two people. If I'm screen sharing, I'm not following the chat. So that would be a little technical issue I didn't anticipate. But let's keep going. This is great.
Should we go to the next one?
Well, talking about brown pride, tell us a little bit about this piece and what does brown pride mean? What does this piece mean?
So brown pride is a part of the Castro series, and it's referencing how social scientists have created the consensus of race. It's a, you know, it's a sort of, they believe that it's a socially constructed concept, and so in a sense, it's created by man, but humans, but the implications are real, right? So we live in these radically racially ordered societies. So we might say like, oh my gosh, I can't believe in the Casta system that they would actually base privileges or access to things based on race. But the reality is in contemporary society, it still exists. We go back not too many generations. My mother would write back to Mexico and we saved the letters. And if you read them, she talks about, and so she's only the generation after me, coming to the United States and being able to enter a restaurant because she is lighter skinned. And there was a story about an aunt that had come and it had difficulties because she was dark skinned and they assumed she was Black and she wasn't allowed to enter the restaurant. So I think if you look back in history not that long ago, the 50s and 60s, they actually in the United States used to have what they called the paper bag test. And this was something that they used for racial discrimination in the United States. And they would actually have the bag in the entrance of an establishment. And then they would put the bag up to someone's arm, and then that would help them determine whether or not the person should be granted access to enter the establishment. So I created this piece on an actual brown paper bag, and then it has juxtaposed the words brown pride. And in the text, this is considered Cholo text or font because it's like LA from Mexican, kind of like gang graffiti style. And at the same time, it's a distinguished font. So it resembles 17th century English style script, which was often used for legal documents. And Cholos have adopted this font and it's become very characteristic of graffiti and used for tagging. And I find it really interesting that they've appropriated it to a certain degree, this font that is determining like documents of importance. So to me, I think it's interesting, the concept of appropriation and how things are classified as belonging to a certain culture or a certain group, and then how they might be taken by a different group and then interpreted in a different way. And so that's where the idea for this piece came from.
So, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Speaking about how you're saying that that text is part of like Cholo culture, what defines Mexican culture to you?
Well, I think that's a challenging question, because I think identity is to a certain degree self-created. I mean, there's different ideas of nature versus nurture. I mean, there's the debate, were you born that way, or is it something that you learned along the way? And I think that within us, we have a certain degree of decision that we make that might be based on our interests and things that we want to, for instance, continue. I mean, maybe there's something that your family has done for generations and it's handed down to you, and then you decide whether or not you're going to continue to do those traditions or those customs. And sometimes it's our own decision, such as something you learn how to cook, or foods that you learn how to make. And other times that might be different challenges that are imposed from outside factors as well. For instance, I was fortunate enough that my father met my mother in Mexico, so they both spoke Spanish at home. And then I learned the language in the household. And so I grew up bilingual, but not everyone has access to the language, even if they wanted to. So certain things are handed down, and then other things I think people decide and determine and carry with them. But I think that's part of my definition.
And speaking of, Mexican culture, do you think that there's something that unites people as Hispanic or as Latino, or do you think that those are more geographical terms? Is there a distinction that can be drawn? Like, where does Mexican culture start or Hispanic culture start?
Well, yeah, and my culture is definitely going to be distinct because I grew up in the United States primarily. So I think that there's different classifications in the US that we can distinguish different groups. I really find it intriguing, like the classification of Hispanic, terminology, like the Hispanic is the US government term that defines, those of Latin American descent, but then that wouldn't include you, Rebecca, right? Because you're Brazilian. And so that's intriguing to me. But yet maybe you and Fernanda have enough in common that you share and celebrate cultural aspects together, even though Fernanda's from Mexican descent. And so there's some really beautiful things, I think, about unifying the culture and finding things that people have in common, and how they are brought together. And sometimes we even adopt, certain things like music or dancing because of our Latinidad within the United States. There's like another level, I think, of a unification that might happen between different cultures that become part of the Latina, Latinx culture within the United States. But measuring those identities, such as the census, I think is complex, because some people might in the United States consider their family of origin, like I might say I'm Mexican or I'm Mexican American. And then others might have what commonalities they share with those residing within the United States. So how do we group people together and how do we count them is really challenging, because maybe I consider myself Mexican American, which is my family's origin, versus many Mexican Americans would say they're Chicanos because they were raised here within the US. So it's a separate culture. Or maybe Latinx is something that people identify more because they feel like that culture is distinct from the culture that comes from Mexico.
So changing the conversation a little bit, we're going to start talking about immigration. And we have this piece here called The Field Worker. And as you can see, it's pretty recent and it's inspired from the coronavirus and everything. What was your inspiration for this piece exactly?
And so as I stated, I started looking at classifying and grouping of casta, of race and culture. And then I started to realize, like, more from the political aspect of what that implies, or what does that mean at a national or international level. So this particular piece is a tribute to essential field workers in the US. This is a piece I did recently, just in the last few months. with the pandemic. I wanted to do acknowledge the field workers as they provide our food supply, especially during the pandemic. So fruits and vegetables are picked by hand, and it's a very undesirable job. Agricultural work is really physically demanding, and they're subjected to extremely long hours and scorching sun and pesticides. And so the majority of the farm workers that help with food production in agricultural jobs are Mexican. And I'd say about half of them have legal immigration status. I mean, probably approximately half are US citizens, but the other half are probably not. And so the administration recently, because of the pandemic and such, has given temporary relief of deportation because of the need for this labor shortage that we have in the farming and agricultural industry. And yet at the same time, they are in these working conditions and they are denied. Their pay is extremely low. They have insufficient benefits and inadequate health care. And the working conditions have even exacerbated more since the pandemic because they are working in these really tight communities, like they're living together. So they're contracting the coronavirus at much higher rates, and they're working closely in the fields and in the packing facilities. And then that as well is potentially devastating as far as the pandemic. And then secondary is the impact of the country's food security, because now there's the fires as well in California and some of these other areas in the Southwest that they're trying to deal with. So this is the piece that I did, and it's the pandemic, he's like collecting it as he's working in the field, and it's surrounding him as well.
So the name of this event and of the exhibition is Paper Promises, and that is referencing this artwork on the left that references the lack of aid and care given to Puerto Rico after the tragedy of Hurricane Maria. Do you feel there's a connection between these two works and these two situations, and how immigrants and even US citizens were treated as outsiders?
Yeah. I think, like I said, besides mitigating racial issues, my artwork analyzes what related societal stratifications, like how people are divided, whether it's citizenship or immigration. And I think that it's partly that these are like more political topics that are happening. It is affecting people directly, but it's kind of addressing them at a national scope. Puerto Rico is a commonwealth and it's controlled by the US. So I did Paper Promises referencing the two hurricanes that hit in 2017, Irma and Maria, and how they caused massive landslides and damage. And I believe there were over 3,000 people killed, and they were left without power and food and water for an extensive amount of time, some people more than a year. And so the economics was devastating. And when it's a commonwealth and part of the United States, then there's that interest, that concern that how are these people being treated? So again, like to me, whether it's the field worker, even if it's a transitory worker, like someone who's here only temporarily, or if it's Puerto Rico, which is considered a commonwealth, I feel that in a way it's establishing a sort of what we would, I don't know if the term is still used, but maybe second-class citizens. And that's problematic, I think, to me, because the government then is denying them I guess, their legal rights or their civil rights or their social economic rights. Like they're not providing sufficient assistance or, I think, respecting them as part of the United States.
And so, and so in your series, Coyotes y Gallinas, which we see one of the pieces here, there's this artwork titled Los Gallos. How do you think it represents your experience with immigration and obtaining your citizenship, but also the language barrier? You know, saying the same thing but in a different way.
You know, it's funny because my mother says that when my sister and I were little, that we used to have cockfights. Like just, so when we'd get mad at each other, we would crow at each other. We would like, ah, you know, like, kickity-kee, kickity-kee. Just like a bizarre way of squabbling as siblings. But I think part of it's cultural. Like to me, this is, I think the fights are, the rooster fights are much more common in Latin America than they are in the US, but it is customary. It does happen still. I was recently in Colombia with my husband, Javier Tavera, and we saw that they had the arena set up for cockfights. But for me here, it was with the, especially with the language, that it was meant to be an exclamation of, I guess, like, the fact that you could see, you could have the same reality and see something so totally different. So how could it be possible that we hear kikiriki or we hear cock-a-doodle-doo? I mean, they're not even close, right? And it's the same animal. And so to me, I found it representative, like politically in the United States, like how different groups can have completely different realities, right? Like the way they view something. And so whether the topic is healthcare or the economy or climate change or immigration, that political debates that, you know, they just go into this heated bipartisan rancor where they're just arguing and there's disagreements. And I wonder sometimes, is like, you know, is it because they can't see the rooster saying the same thing, right? I mean, and so if we can't, like, I guess our perception of reality, you know, our disagreements, when we're looking at the same exact fact, you know, it's hard to find compromise. So I thought it was representative politically in how there's not a consensus if you're talking about the same thing.
And so earlier this month, Ola had a showing of the movie Frida, which is a biopic on Frida Kahlo, who was, you know, I'm sure everybody in this webinar has heard her name. She was one of Mexico's most influential artists and is known globally as one of the most significant artists in the 20th century. I don't know if Fernanda is a big fan.
She was a political activist, a feminist, and a very avid painter. She was famous for her self-portraits and how raw and honest they all were in the portrayal of her life. And most of all, she was known for her love of Mexico and the culture and the symbols that surrounded her life and her art, much like yours. And as a researcher, you published a comprehensive list of Frida's exhibitions and a bibliography for the Walker Art Center's Frida Kahlo exhibition catalog. And we'd love to talk about her and her influence, not only on you, but on the influence of the modern world and in your art.
So you had mentioned earlier, or in our earlier runs and conversations, that your work in Sancho Pancho Villa, this beautiful artwork, was inspired by your time at the Frida Kahlo exhibition at the Walker Art Center. Could you tell us a little bit about your experience and about this work?
Yeah, so when I worked on the Frida Kahlo exhibition, I think it was 2007, they were providing tours in Spanish, and there was very few of them, probably lack of translators or guides. And I had an interest in figuring out ways to encourage the Latino community to go to the exhibition and also make sure that they had access. Like, it was really important to me that if this artwork was coming to Minneapolis, that the Latino community was able to see the exhibition. And so I worked with Becky Garza, who at the time was at the Mercado Central, which is in the heart of South Minneapolis on Lake Street in the Latino community. And we were able to obtain funding to have school buses, or maybe they're regular buses, I can't remember, but, and then we just picked up people on Lake Street and took them to the exhibition. So literally we're there like encouraging, saying, come on in, get on the bus. And they were like, where are we going? What are we doing? And it's like, we're gonna go see some art. And it was really fun because some of them were familiar with Frida Kahlo and some weren't. And then we took them there. And then when we had a group of women there, they were talking about how Frida Kahlo was bisexual or lesbian, and her sexual preferences and such. And then it was interesting to me at the same time, they were touching their eyebrows and talking about how they had to have their eyebrows manicured. And I suddenly made the connection that they were unifying like the unibrow. They were associating the unibrow, which is iconic to Frida Kahlo, with the fact that she was probably what was considered sexually deviant in that time and even up to now, right? So, so while they're telling this about, they were talking about their eyebrows needing to be manicured, and I started to think like, how can you associate like facial hair with your sexual preference? But when you think about it, like there's so many things that are, that are part of our society and our view of physical traits. And so how do we tie those to race and ethnicity, and how do we associate them with someone and classify them? And so through an ethnographic lens, like I try to find these cultural signifiers, and then I try to determine like, how does our society define ourselves? Like, how do we look at our gender or our culture? And then what does like physical traits have to do with that? So is it your facial or body hair, right? It might be associated with masculinity, for instance. And I think that's true. I mean, I think even today, hairy armpits or things like that. Like we associate physical traits with gender, culture, all the different categories in the US. So to me, I created this piece that was in search of Pancho Villa, and it has the images of actors and political figures and a revolutionary and a poet and a comedian. And then what it found was that I found it really intriguing that when people would come to the exhibition, that many, especially the Latinos, would be able to identify who the person was simply by their mustache. And so they could actually see who it was, and they would call out, it's Cantinflas, or it's Zapata, or, and so I found it comical, entertaining, exciting that they were identifying with it. But the one in the bottom, right, when I presented to students at the Tweed Museum, they said, wait, I think I know him. And I said, go ahead, tell me, who do you think it is? And they said, it looks like Orlando Bloom. And I said, it is. And they were like, but he's not Mexican. And my response was, are you sure? Because with the Sharpie mustache of Pancho Villa, he might be. And so I was making fun of, like, if you were to change your look or your facial hair, could you transition and become part of the culture? And so it's a Sharpie mustache that I actually drew on him.
Well, one of her works exemplifies the identity and contrast between American and Mexican culture. And as you can see, that there's a lot of negativity surrounding Mexican culture in this picture, and she's trying to portray that there's that contrast. Do you think that there's this amalgamation and preservation of culture, and that this is a universal experience?
You have good questions. So this painting, I think, on the Mexican side, I think Kahlo is, she's depicting, people could interpret it so many different ways, but I think she's depicting Mexico, I think, as the foliage, like the natural plants and such that are down below, like that's her Mexico, right? Like the floral. And then the United States, it seems, is more of that, like one side is Mexico and one side is the United States. So one's more indigenous and then the other one is more industrial. And so it's obviously stating to some degree maybe her feelings of what it meant to be in the United States, so far from Mexico, like being far away, the nostalgia, yearning to be back in her country, but because she's portraying the United States as industrial and the pollution and the destruction and such. And so I think that this piece is reflective of her feelings. I don't think she ever really considered herself a Mexican in the United States. I think she always considered herself more of a Mexican that she's visiting. But this piece is specifically referencing the border, right, between Mexico and the United States. So I think that the border concept is ties to all Latinos that are, all Mexicans that are in the US. I think that it's part of who we are, even if you come, even if you're here and you didn't necessarily cross the border. I think that we're influenced by these racial geographies that have been produced over the centuries, and they influence our identity and our models of who we are. And so the Frida Kahlo, I think, is part of that concept of being Mexican in the United States. And then, like, as far as universal, you know, Frida mania is, you know, she's a celebrity, and I think that's due to many different factors. I mean, she has probably cult status, and like Che Guevara, she's very like people can identify her pretty easily, right? And so I think that though she's someone that people have encompassed, like had absorbed because of many different reasons. So maybe in the United States, they may associate her with feminism, and that because of the fact that she was radical. I mean, she portrayed women as the subjects that were pretty taboo in that time, like maternity and sexuality and emancipation of gender roles. And so she was radical, and then people could identify with that and celebrate that. But in Mexico, I think the narrative is a little bit different, like her autobiographical paintings tie probably closer to the fact that she's considered a national treasure. I mean, her paintings are part of the national treasure, and the emphasis of her symbolism might be more on the cultural pride and the indigenous nature of her wearing clothing, which in those times would be considered eccentric, but definitely like celebrating pre-Columbian, right? Tehuantepec Indians, or the matriarchal society that they had. And so in Mexico, she's even on the 500 peso bill, and it contains two portraits. Her husband's on one side and she's on the other. And so she's definitely celebrated as an artist and personality in Mexico, but I would say that her image is a little bit interpreted a little bit differently.
Yes, absolutely. And so with all the work you've done in, you know, doing the big bibliography for the Walker Art Center and all that you know about Frida, if you had to give three key takeaways on her life and her legacy, what would they be?
I think that with Frida, I mean, she's the importance, like when that exhibition came, I think it was such a spectacular opportunity for people. I mean, even though she's iconic and everyone knows who she is, it's so important that people have access to see the paintings in an exhibition, to have access to them. Similar to, you know, I think just becoming more familiar with pieces maybe they didn't even know before. But in the world of art, like that, she's part of the Mexicanidad like movement, which is usually described as like that post-revolutionary intellectual aesthetic movement that delineated like this celebration of indigenous culture and Mexican culture that separated itself, you know, from European and US influences somewhat. And so she's definitely providing insight into the Mexican culture in that time period, but also, like we say, that so many people can identify with her up to today. So very significant and important, I think, historically and culturally. And so that's, I think. where I would leave it.
Well, here we have a really recent digital drawing of yours. What can you tell us about this, and what are you trying to portray with this?
So this is the image illustration that I did. It's one of a series for the exhibition that opens at the end of the month at Oglethorpe, and it'll be this series in particular is political. It references the pandemic and the combination too of the incident of the murder of George Floyd. We actually live in the Powderhorn neighborhood in Minneapolis, which is very close to where he died. And I wanted to do some artworks that expressed sort of the chaotic nature of what's been happening the last few months since the pandemic started, and then the unrest. So these prints, their illustrations actually might feel a little bit more chaotic, I think, because of that, but it definitely is referencing as well the unity of what we've been able to accomplish in South Minneapolis. Although it's been a lot of suffering and struggles, I think there's a lot of hope, and people have been working really closely together to make sure that people are taking precautions with the pandemic, and that with the food deserts that have been created with, that there's actually access to resources and organizations when protests do occur. And so it's meant to be referencing everything that's been going on. And it's one of a series.
We have a pretty heavy question. What do you hope your legacy will be?
Oh boy. I'm hoping to continue to make artwork, and I really am struggling always to figure out ways through iconography to express the modern climate of what's happening racially, culturally. I want to celebrate the things that we find, the similarities. I want to understand the differences. And so I'm hoping that with the series that I create, that I don't want to establish and tell people what I think is, for instance, what is happening with racial issues in the United States, but I want us to be able to find ways through the artwork to talk about these complicated issues. And I'm hoping that it opens up the opportunity more often that we can gather and then discuss the things that we might not always see eye to eye, just like those gallos, the roosters.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the share, which is regretful because I've only just seen this digital print for the last few hours. But let me just see if I can stop the share here, and then we'll do Q&A.
And it seems like we already have one of the questions. Yeah.
Good.
So the first question comes from Kennedy Morgan. Does the switchboard have any specific meaning? In the Black community, we have to code switch and change how we speak around non-Black people. Did you have a similar experience?
Oh, I love that question. Gonna make me think. Sometimes I feel like I shouldn't talk about my art at all. I should just ask what people see, because they come up with better answers. My husband says the same thing. So I think that the original idea came from when I was trying to connect people of that didn't have, like suddenly people were extremely generous in providing food and resources, and like if it was COVID testing or something, and it just seemed like, I mean, everyone was getting involved in trying to distribute things to make the situation much more tolerable and safer and survival and such. And so the board is actually the communication, like an old operator, and it was more so just meaning that connecting the need with the resource But I really like the idea of that as well, because I think code switching is necessary to do that, right? And I think people have to be able to, especially when they're bicultural, it could be to your advantage, because you can switch languages, or you understand the community a little bit better. So I picked her in particular as the iconic symbol of that, because she's a danzante and her family's really involved in the community. And I can't even imagine, there's so many people to give credit to, but I felt like, especially young people, they have that fluidity a lot easier sometimes, and they can go between situations, and everybody was so helpful in making sure those connections were made. So.
Do we have other questions? You can put them into the chat. I see there's still 38 people listening in. And I also noted that, and I didn't realize this, Iris Ponce is starting a PhD program at Yale this fall. So more Ogles taking flight. I'm sure there are questions out there.
Don't be shy. We've in these dry runs, we've had so many wonderful conversations, and I remember we had we had a meeting before, trying to decide, okay, what can we condense this to, what should we focus the conversation on, because there was just so much that we wanted to say in this. So if you guys have any questions, I'm sure we've run through it and we'd be happy to answer them.
Okay, we have another question from Laura Milan. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. Given the history of printmaking and protests and revolution throughout history, what role do you think printmaking can play right now to advance racial and social justice?
Excellent. Yeah, printmaking is, and my great grandfather was a printer, and in Mexico, and I have my aunts and uncles are all artists and artisans, and printmaking is a spectacular way to distribute artwork. You can mass produce, and you can generate more copies than if you did a painting, for instance. And so a lot of the prints, the most recent prints that I've done even are in print portfolio exchanges, where the artists have a theme. For instance, the field worker was actually from the theme was Langston Hughes's Dream Deferred, and then all the artists interpret it their way. And I love to see how different artists have a topic and then they branch off whatever their experience is or their printing style is. So I think that, especially for people of color right now that are trying to sort through these issues and want to communicate their thoughts and feelings, that printmaking is one of the best ways and efficient ways to distribute and share your artwork.
Awesome, yeah. And then I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing this incorrectly, but Neo Dake said, is there a medium that you most identify with?
I love printmaking for that reason, that it's, and I do different types of printmaking, whether it's woodblock or screen printing. Sometimes though, I have an idea of what I want to express, and then it'll change the medium that I'm working in. So I wasn't able to do installations for this particular exhibition because of the limitations with the pandemic. But sometimes I'll do 3D work. I recently did, it was like a tent that was called Refuge, and it was made out of coffee bags, and it represented when people are traveling, when they're refugees, and how they need to look for protection and safety along the way. And so the bags, the coffee bags, all had printed on them the different iconography from where they came from in Latin America. And so it was a structure in 3D, but I do really enjoy printmaking.
Here we have another question from Kennedy Morgan. on the concept of appropriation, do you think there is a difference between appropriation and commercialization?
Oh gosh, these are good questions. Appropriation is something I love to do, and then I have mixed feelings about it. Because appropriation is fabulous because if you have like iconography, more people will identify with it if it's something they've seen before. If it's something that they can relate to. I mean, I was thinking about it because I was writing up labels for this particular exhibition, and I thought, like you could put Mickey Mouse, or you could put Charlie Brown, and most people have a reference to who they are, and they can actually like riff off that. And if Charlie, if Snoopy is like lying down on something that's not his house, people have that prior knowledge of, oh, he's always lying down on top of his house, right? So if you put him on top of, I don't know, a burning building or something, you're going to put together at least the conversation of where he comes from and what he means and such. But it's really hard with appropriation. So I like to appropriate images from magazines and games and such, but sometimes like the iconography doesn't relate to people in the US, like it might be specific to Mexico or people who grew up in Mexico. But I enjoy combining, and Jamie Ratliff, who's an art historian, said, I like to try to make like a new language by combining, through appropriation, you can put ideas together and say something different, right? But commercialization to me is when you're doing it for the purpose of making money only. So if I think Frida Kahlo would be a great example of that. I mean, she's been mass produced on every product you can ever imagine. I mean, I think just recently, like a whole set of dishes came out and it's not even her artwork. They said that it just, it has the essence of Frida Kahlo. So like, it's just, she's been repeatedly, like her imagery, iconography is, and so when it's to that point where its intention is to simply make money, and then I see it more as commercialization.
And Zach Jackson asked, have you ever encountered any opposition to your art, the art itself or its meaning? And if you could, is there another group, religion, ethnicity, class, that you would like to portray in your art?
Yeah, I think sometimes people struggle. I mean, one, I've had people struggle with the fact that they might not understand it. And I mean, I think that people in the US, I mean, they might be used to having access to so much information and so many things that there's a level of frustration when they have to work towards figuring something out. So I'm sure that it's politically controversial. I don't know if everyone's come to me and said like that they don't agree with my political views, but because it is very political, I would imagine that there's people that wouldn't be in agreement, especially in this day and age, right? That we're becoming so divisive. But I think the other part was other cultures, even within my own culture, I struggle because I grew up in the United States. So I'm really careful about the iconography and the subjects that I choose. When you start portraying other cultures, it becomes more sensitive in misunderstandings, and it can become more complicated in knowing if you're appropriately representing that group in that way. So I'm a little hesitant unless I'm invited, like if there's the theme or the topic and the whole group is addressing it together, then I feel like there's a little bit more flexibility, but I'm pretty focused myself on the Latinidad within the United States and what my community is going through.
There's one from John Tilford. As a master printmaker / artist, which artists have influenced your work in this media?
Oh gosh, there's so many, but I think I started printmaking in my kitchen with YouTube videos, and I was obsessed with Guadalupe Posada, and I'd grown up, most of the art history from Mexico lessons that I had were from my aunts and uncles in Mexico. And Guadalupe Posada made thousands and thousands of prints and told stories that were legends. And sometimes he combined things that were true with things that were he would do like current events, but then it would be the most outrageous. And so something like the last piece that I just created, I would say has that kind of like fantastic sort of fantasy, where I'm combining current events that are happening, but then, you know, like her braids are huge and they're extending and they're circling. And so then it has that sort of imaginary component to it. And so I really enjoyed that about Guadalupe Posada, and he was a printmaker. So I think there's a lot of influence specifically for him, because I started making legends that were oral stories that were told, a woodblock series that were historically told orally, and I wanted to capture them, like El Chupacabra or La Llorona or La Ciguanaba, which is from, you know, like more of the Guatemala and southern Mexico. So these tales have been told for generations. And so what did they look like? And so I started with that imagery and illustration, and then I went more into the Costa and then my personal experience. And now it's going more political.
And Janie Martis says, thank you for this beautiful presentation. I am a white middle-class woman raising a white boy, age 6. He is in a Spanish immersion school that I love. However, given the pandemic-related constraints, there are limitations around cultural education. Might I get some visual art suggestions? And then she had also said, I'd like to acknowledge how insanely broad that question was.
Oh my gosh. Well, now it seems like on the internet, there's everything, right? Yeah, I think it's hard. I mean, the neighbor kids in our block, I mean, some of them are Spanish speaking, some of them are learning Spanish. And so sometimes like music might be a good access. Like you could get music that has really simple songs. And I think that language is important for sharing culture, and music can repeat words over and over again, so that if they're learning the language and they learn what the words mean and it goes round and round, it'll actually stick inside their minds. But our kids are in their 20s, so it's hard for me to know what might be out there now for children that are younger. And so it would be more so looking into things like that. But I always think music is a beautiful way to communicate culture.
Professor Lutz asks, have you addressed the issue of caravans and refugees traveling through Mexico to reach the US?
That was actually the 3D piece that I did, Refuge, was actually about how they're coming into the US. And it was an invitation for an exhibition actually called Caravan. And so the artists, they did that project based on thinking about how people travel into the US.
And then Elliot Cohen asked, you mentioned that your father is from Ireland and your mother is from Mexico, I believe. Do you feel a drive to create art related to Irish culture as well as Mexican culture?
You know, I thought I would probably get that question. It's interesting because my dad is not an immigrant. And so I would say more so it's, I would say I have a Minnesota culture than an Irish culture. And you can probably note that in my thick Minnesota accent. But so I think I identify more with the things that I grew up with here in Minnesota. And I haven't done as much artwork about my Minnesota upbringing. And I think partly it's because I'm close to my family that's in Mexico. And a lot of this has started first as like a yearning and a longing, nostalgia. I wanted to understand that part of me. And so I, because of my connection to them, my grandmother's 101 and she's still alive. And so like I wanted to learn about the culture and the art, and I had a huge fascination for all of that and the nostalgia. But then on top of that, like raising children in Minnesota, then you want to pass on the culture to them. And so they probably had the Minnesota culture just from living here and being part of Minnesota. But the part from Mexico, like I really emphasized keeping traditions, whether it was like Day of the Dead and building altars, ofrendas, or things like that, because it was important to me that they understood that culture and they learned the language and such.
We have one more question from an anonymous attendee. What are your thoughts on white passing Latinx privilege within the context of the current climate?
Oh, we just had this conversation. You know, I find that, and it's something I didn't talk about as much, is race issues. First, with the census, something I didn't talk about is the division. And one is that the government makes us choose race. And the 4 races that we have to choose from are white, black, indigenous, and Asian. So I find that really problematic. As I said, like when I probably would prefer putting mestizo, and it's not a term. And we're always struggling with terminology. We're always struggling with classifications. And when it comes to the census and deciding who's going to have access to certain resources, it's really important that we find ways to have a consensus, right? I mean, it's find ways that that Latinos, whether we're Brazilian or, you know, a Mexican or what, you know, we unify when it's important, such as that. And, but as someone who's fair skinned in my family, my siblings are much darker skinned than I am. And I can see the difference between people that are lighter skinned and darker skinned, whether they're indigenous or black. I think that there's definitely other things tied in our culture that are so made up with thing tied to privilege, thing tied to access and such. And so I would say that although I probably would be considered white passing, like now I'm learning that that term actually is negative in the sense that it means that you actually deny your roots. And that's definitely something that I haven't been doing, that I'm actually looking for ways always to incorporate my culture into my daily life. So I think that there is, though, a recognition on my part to being lighter skinned that there's definitely privileges and access that comes along with that. And so I can only hope to work towards, I think, fighting for justice and equity in whatever capacity that gives me, is what I would say.
Yeah, I absolutely. And Renee Alvarez said he did not mean to make the question anonymous. So if you wanted to know who asked, it was Renee. But it is 6:07. And so if anyone has any remaining questions, speak now or forever hold your peace.
I've got a comment to throw out there. Tina mentioned a couple of times that the show opens the end of the month, and we are not open to the public, but thanks to Fabio Musio and Grant Utter, who's on this talk right now, we have an incredible 360 virtual tour that's in the works that's going to debut. It's really, really beautiful. We took a sneak peek this morning when we did our tech run through. So that's happening, and that'll open on October 30th and run through March 14th. So it's extended. And we also have works from the collection and a few select things from UGA, from Georgia Museum, that are by Rufino Tamayo. But I want to thank all of you, and I know you have a few things more that you want to say, but thank you so much, Rebecca and Fernanda, for managing this so beautifully.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you guys so much for coming. We have one last comment, and then I will say a few words and then pass it off to Fernanda. But an anonymous attendee said, "This is very interesting, so thank you. I'm half Mexican, but grew up in America. It is a little tough being white passing and growing up in America because I feel so distant from my culture. Although I do recognize how privilege benefits me. You've given a lot of insight about how to get past that disconnect. Thank you for doing this and speaking on privilege." And then a follow-up to that was, what are some ways we can maintain our culture or not lose our cultural identity?
I think that would be for you and Fernanda, right? You and Fernanda, who are making an effort to continue programming at the university level that's not open, not just to Latinos, right? But open to anyone in general. I think that's important as well, so that we can learn about each other's cultures. And so I think that is where programming and access and it is just as important.
Yeah, absolutely. I know there's a very large Brazilian population, especially down in Marietta, and you see at certain times of the year there's those June parties or those festivities that definitely keep the culture alive and keep that little piece of Brazil that's in my heart, and also keeping in contact with my family helps a lot to keep the culture alive, not only in my home but also in here.
I know every Latinx family has a different way of growing up here in the US, but at least we have that way of connecting each other, and especially with everything that's going on right now, we need to maintain that unity within our community.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all for coming out tonight. We wanted to thank the Oglethorpe University Museum of Art, specifically Elizabeth Peterson. You have been a rock these last few weeks, and Renee Alvarez for bringing us all together and graciously introducing us to Tina. I feel like we have not only gained a connection but a friendship in this experience. We wanted to thank the Consul General of Mexico in Atlanta, Javier Díaz de León. He, for coming, for being so gracious and donating to Oglethorpe, and Dean Michelle Hall for taking the time out of her schedule to come here. Even if you didn't speak, your presence is more than enough. And we wanted to thank Tina specifically for her dedication and her work, her exhibition. Like we've been saying, Promesas de Papel, Paper Promises, opens October 30th, so stay on the lookout. We got a sneak peek. It is absolutely beautiful, and I will say stay on the lookout because Elizabeth is incredible and she has included some Easter eggs in the exhibition, so stay on the lookout for that too. And for our final remarks, I'll pass it down to Fernanda.
Okay, real quick, we have one final comment. Thank you all for a wonderful event from Viviana Plotnick. And to finalize, we would like to read an excerpt from one of Frida Kahlo's letters as a reminder that underneath it all, we are all humans who love, cry, laugh, and feel. All this madness, if I asked it of you, I know in your silence there would only be confusion. I ask you for violence in the nonsense, and you give me grace, your light and your warmth. I'd like to paint you, and there are no colors, because there are so many in my confusion, the tangible form of my great love. Thank you all so much for coming. I hope you guys have a very good night and the rest of your day.